Sage Wanderer here, coming at you from my cabin down by the creek. So today we're going to talk about the Insurrection Act. We're going to talk about martial law. What's the difference? We're going to look at the history of insurrections in the United States, the foundation of this act known as the Insurrection Act, and discuss whether or not Donald Trump might enact the Insurrection Act and take control of both the streets of Chicago and the streets of Portland, Oregon. So before we get started, though, I want to thank all of you for your continued financial support. This channel is funded exclusively by viewers like you. It's your kind donations that keep me fed, keep my lights on here in the cabin, and keep these videos coming to you. So please consider becoming a financial contributor through the links in the description below. You'll find links to Cash App, to PayPal, and to my post office box. And thank you so much for those of you who do support this channel with your financial gifts. Okay, so word on the street and word from the horse's mouth himself that President Donald Trump is floating the idea of enacting the Insurrection Act. What is the Insurrection Act? This all kind of stems from a thing called the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton, I believe he was the Secretary of the Treasury, enacted a tax on the creation of whiskey. Not the selling of it, not the bartering with it, but the actual production of whiskey from grain. And this affected the rural people of Western Pennsylvania, who relied on this not just for drinking or to sell, but also as a form of currency. They would trade it for labor, for goods and services. And Alexander Hamilton saw this as a great opportunity to replenish some of the funds in the coffers that were spent during the Revolutionary War. This was met with across-the-board outrage by people who had been for centuries already, or at least for 100 years, had been utilizing this method of payment, this method of storing grain. It was easier to transport over long distances than grain. So any excesses that you created from your grain production on your farm that you didn't use or sell locally were turned into whiskey for the purpose of barter. And this was seen as a direct affront and overreach by the federal government. Many of the people involved in the Whiskey Rebellion saw this as the very thing they had just recently fought the British over, taxation, overreach by government. And so a general rebellion broke out. Tax collectors that were sent to enforce this new tax during the Whiskey Rebellion were tarred and feathered. And surprisingly, for something you'd call an insurrection, there was very few people actually killed in this event. And this is an example of a president using overwhelming force and sudden response to put down a rebellion and to punish those responsible for fomenting it. This was the only time in U.S. history that a sitting American president took to the field and led a militia force or a military force while he's a sitting president. So it's one of those groundbreaking moments in U.S. history. So the Insurrection Act itself was put in place to allow President George Washington, to use federal forces to put down this rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. And later on, the Posse Comitatus Act would be passed after this to take that power back and to limit the use of federal forces against U.S. citizens in the course of regular law enforcement. Then the Insurrection Act would be tweaked again to allow for this use, but put limitations and conditions on when a president can use federal forces to enact or to keep the peace or to act as law enforcement. So there are a few requirements for a president to enact the Insurrection Act. I believe the last time it was utilized by a U.S. president was during the Rodney King riots. And that this is when the federal troops and National Guard were sent into LA to put a stop to an ongoing violent and deadly and expensive, destructive season of rioting that came after the Rodney King beating was the video was not just disseminated to the people, but when the officers involved basically went unpunished, then the violence that erupted after that is something that those of us who were alive and aware at the time will never forget. It may be the reason that I started to, it is, in fact, the reason that I started to acquire long guns for defending my home, just in case. Up until then, I was the kind of guy that, I might have a pistol in my pocket to deal with muggers and, life on the street in Dallas. But when that occurred, and the violence that erupted there, and of course, the rooftop Korean businessmen who used the basic assault rifle to defend their property, I saw it as necessary, and I went out and bought a lever action rifle and a pump shotgun like the next day. And since then, I've graduated to more effective forms of weaponry, but I picked the guns I was familiar with, and so it had a big effect on me. And so what we're dealing with is a group of individuals that are working collectively to try to prevent ICE agents from doing their job. So they might ascend on to a situation where ICE is involved in a raid. Most of the violent protests have been against ICE facilities around the country. There's been shootings in Texas. There's been shootings in Chicago and Portland based around this. People have died. In fact, I would say that as of right now, the ICE insurrection looks more like way more threatening than the Whiskey Rebellion ever was. And maybe the reason that more decisive action hasn't come from the federal government is it's not hitting them in the pocketbook like the Whiskey Rebellion did, right? I mean, follow the money. You want to get motivated, get the government motivated, hit them in their budget, in their pocketbook. So, with more and more damage being caused and more cost of thwarting these ICE facility attacks and demonstrations, the more that starts to rack up a cost, the more likely it is that Donald Trump will enact the Insurrection Act. So what power does that give him, and what grounds would he use? So there's several different criterion that can be used to enact the Insurrection Act. And it's the third one in the list, according to constitutional professors that I've been tuned into, that it's the third on the list that he'll likely use if he does decide to do this. And that is when law enforcement is being hampered and cannot do their job and cannot protect the people, cannot protect the laws of our state or the nation, then a president is authorized to declare an insurrection to come in and clean it up. And one thing about the Whiskey Rebellion is there was a lot of violence leading up to the Insurrection Act being utilized, and George Washington putting together a force of 13,000 militiamen from around the country. And that was the biggest force, ironically, that George Washington ever commanded. So he never had an army that big during the Revolutionary War. So it's the biggest army at that date to be rallied. And he came against these rebels in western Pennsylvania with an overwhelming force. It was essentially a military invasion. And the result was the rebels decided to disperse, and it was the end of the rebellion, and there was no armed conflict with the force. The force came in, took over, arrested the people that were fomenting the violence, and two of them were actually, in the long run, convicted of treason. And then George Washington did something that I think is something that President Trump should consider in his future behavior. George Washington could have hung those two men in a public trial. I mean, in a public execution, rather. And instead, he chose to pardon them as a way of making his point, letting them know he could do that, and at the same time showing mercy and reconciliation. So that is one option that, And you got to know, President Trump is fully aware and very schooled on the Whiskey Rebellion. He sees what's happening now with Antifa and uh, and these other parallel groups and trans activist groups that are engaging in acts of violence, random shootings, targeted assassinations like Charlie Kirk, and the attacks, the protests that are not peaceful, that are meant to disrupt, that are occurring at ICE facilities around the country, and sometimes ending in deadly confrontations. And I think he would be absolutely authorized, according to the criteria that I have researched, to enact the Insurrection Act. And I just hope that he doesn't do it piecemeal, because I really think had George Washington sent in a small force to try to, maybe something equal to the size of the rebel force that was causing so much havoc, breaking so much havoc, that had he done that and met them with a small force, they might have been tempted to fight back, and they might have been tempted to engage. But it was George Washington's raising of the biggest army in the history of the young republic and sending that out in force to deal with it. The word came quickly that an overwhelming force is coming, and anyone who stands up to this overwhelming force will be crushed. And so people stayed home. People decided to change their ways. They decided that maybe, even though taxation is theft, I think most of us can agree that it was wiser to pay the tax than it was to fight this overwhelming army. And so I think in the case of Portland especially, and I point Portland out because I'm so familiar with it. I'm from there, and that is where this channel started. Was there in the Willamette Valley, Portland-Salem area, and I'm very familiar with Antifa. I had several friends in Antifa. I have stood toe to toe with them, and I'm one of the, if not the, I may be the original Antifa whistleblower. That I don't know that anybody still on YouTube has been blowing the whistle more than I have, and that includes Tim Pool, who was kind of apathetic towards Antifa until I wised him up to what a communist purge and revolution looks like, and let him know that that's what they are planning. And it kind of changed up. I feel like it changed up Tim Pool's opinion. I wasn't the only one presenting that case at the time. Alex Jones played a role as well in the conversion of Tim Pool from a moderate Democrat, sympathetic to some of these causes, to somebody who sees them for the threat that they are. But from the beginning, I've been blowing the whistle about these communist organizations and their intention to take down our country. So even though the press will say this is about the activities of ICE agents and the nabbing of people off the street, and sometimes American citizens getting caught up in the dragnet during this time of rounding up illegal aliens and sending them back to where they came from, that I think that's what the press wants you to think it's about. But this is just the latest item that Antifa and other parallel organizations have glommed onto to wreak havoc in our country and cause instability. Because ultimately it's their goal to reduce the United States to a point of chaos and inner turmoil until the government itself will fail, law enforcement will throw in the towel, and or the United Nations will become involved in peacekeeping forces in the United States, allowing them to, in their opinion, have an equal seat at the table so that they can sell their opinion and their point for socialism and more directly a communist utopia that they envision is possible someday. And my concern is that if Donald Trump does this, right, it does not need to be piecemeal. If he's going to take control of the streets in Portland and Chicago, he needs to take control of the streets in Portland and Chicago. I do think that this will be seen. I mean, there's really no win in this situation. I've talked about that in the previous video. This is a lose-lose situation. I don't know how we get out of this without a major fight, right, that might involve every last man and capable human, right, currently living in the United States. That this might be an all-encompassing civil unrest or civil war that could turn into absolute chaos. One of my viewers said, if this is a lose-lose situation, then shouldn't we go out fighting? And I can't agree with that statement. because of the cost of that kind of thing happening. Because children, no matter what side their parents are on politically, no matter what their political views are, children are the ones that pay the price in war. In any war, it's most devastating on the children. They become orphans, they become homeless, they get caught in the crossfire, and without a shadow of a doubt, they universally starve. When food becomes scarce, it's children who pay the price. My love for children will never allow me to sign off on widespread warfare, because whether it's a civil war or an international war, children pay the price. So should we go out fighting? Well, can't we keep looking until we find a solution, something short of all out warfare that can bring an end to this situation? And as much as I am not in favor of federal overreach, federal, government, it should be limited. In this particular situation, when it comes to these attacks on ICE facilities in Portland and Chicago, I think the wise and prudent thing to do would be to enact the Insurrection Act and then follow in the footsteps of what George Washington did. And be honest with you here, I think that whiskey rebellion was tyranny, right? I think taxing those people's whiskey and then sending that army in there was terrible. But one thing it did do was it minimized the human loss. It settled it once and for all, and it minimized the number of people that were killed. That could have turned into a civil war. It could have turned into Pennsylvania against the government. It could have spread to other states. It could have spread to the South. And we could have had the Civil War, 60 some odd years sooner. And it was the wisdom to understand that an overwhelming force with intentions of taking control would be so intimidating that the small group of rebels that were so set on not complying with this tax would figure it wasn't worth it. Right? That they didn't want to see their homes burned, their families displaced, and the massive loss of life. So they just did what they were told. And I think if President Trump sends in a small force, it's going to encourage groups like Antifa to take pot shots at him. It's going to encourage groups like Antifa to try to take federal buildings, to do hit and run terrorist attacks. And I think that the answer, and it's going to look bad, and I may eat my words when this happens because it might backfire, but I think the only way to put down this Antifa left-wing rebellion in our country is by taking the streets with an overwhelming force. Now, is an act like this, enacting the Insurrection Act, does that give the president total power? Absolutely not. It doesn't make anything illegal that was legal. It doesn't make anything legal that was illegal. I think I said that right. But it only allows federal troops to act as local law enforcement, and it's way short of martial law. But having said that, you can't help but see the slippery slope into martial law, at least in these blue cities. That when you send in this force, they're going to take control of the streets. I promise you, a curfew is going to be put in place, a dusk till dawn curfew. And it's going to affect people who work late. It's going to affect people who like to go out and enjoy the nightlife. It's going to affect the businesses of bars and restaurants. It's going to affect the everyday life of people who have nothing to do with this. When you go out, you get pulled over or stopped at a checkpoint. You got, the Fourth Amendment basically gets suspended under a curfew. You got to show ID if you're out and about. You got to explain where you're going to and from, which is a violation of our constitutional rights. So in some ways, it's the beginning of what we call martial law, the control of the streets by the military. And this could spread nationwide. I do know this, and I talked about this in a previous video, that the intention of some of these elites, the intention of some of these leftists who want to take down our government, the intention of these communists who want to employ and put in place their fantasy of a communist utopia, that their plan all along has been to destabilize the United States, introduce widespread chaos and conflict, cause whatever government is in control at the time to overreact, to become the tyrant, to become, politically, to become political pariahs in the eyes of the international community, for the purpose of bringing an international force in, taking over the United States, putting it under foreign military martial law, and then putting together a coalition of all parties and an appointment of a leader that will potentially, hopefully, in their eyes, bridge the gap and bring unity back to our nation. But all of that equals to the end of the United States as we know it, and the beginning of some other society that bears no resemblance to the previous freedoms that we once enjoyed. That these leftists who have been doing this since before the George Floyd riots, they were doing this in Portland as early as 2014. Burning and looting and breaking windows and assaulting people on the street. And it's their tactic because they don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in voting. They don't believe in majority rule or constitutional government or representative government. They don't believe, many of them are anarchists. They don't believe in any government oversight. And if there is going to be a government, they want to be in charge in a totalitarian way where they can punish you for your thought crimes. And so their intention is to destroy this country. And it has to be dealt with. The question is how. And I think if you did this piecemeal, you would probably get resistance. But I think if Donald Trump sent, I don't know, do what Washington did, said 13,000 trained police type federal agents and or military police took over the streets of those two cities, that even though I hate that, right? I think that's the only way where the government can do anything to prevent what's happening, do anything to stop it. If they send in smaller forces like he's doing now, like there's some federal troops that are protecting these ICE facilities, but they're very limited on what they can do. Their reach stops at the curb, right? So they can't go chase these people into the city and arrest them. And I think that an overwhelming force brought into these cities would send a message to these groups around the country. It would even send a message to the United Nations and the international community that the federal government is willing to commit a large, overwhelming force to put down some kind of insurrection. And, I cringe at the idea of it, but I've put all 180 IQ points onto this topic as of late. I've been chewing on it literally for years and specifically for the last few months. And I can't find any other method to deal with this and maybe have a chance of putting an end to it and putting it down before it escalates into to open warfare. That an overwhelming force might cause them all to scatter. If you come in with half measures, if you come in with a small force, they're going to feel emboldened to fight. This is one of those situations where if we don't learn from history, we might be prone to repeat it. So learn from the wisdom of George Washington. As much as I saw that as tyranny, right? To enforce attacks with military force is, to me, the definition of tyranny. But you can't argue with the effectiveness of the method. By the force being so large and so overwhelming, it struck fear into the hearts of the rebels and they vanished. And but also with that is this measure of grace and forgiveness and mercy, that once the two individuals that were seen at the root of the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania were convicted of treason against the United States government, they were then quickly pardoned by the president. So I think that that if Donald Trump can borrow, this fly is just bothering me. If Donald Trump can borrow from the wisdom of the founding father and father of our country, George Washington, and send in a very regulated and controlled but excessively large military force in and take these streets for a period of time, round up all the people involved, and then treat them with mercy as a way of extending an olive branch to all of those who would have been emboldened by their execution. He kept them from becoming martyrs. They could have easily been executed for treason, but instead he pardoned them. So tell me what you think. Is any of this going to happen? Is it going to lead to a larger, widespread martial law? This is my concern, that if the violence continues, that military the military will take control of every street in the United States. I do not want to see tanks rolling down the street in Oklahoma City. I don't think there's any need for it. But if things got out of control, well, sometimes when you give people power, they hunger for more. And an insurrection act could lead to a widespread martial law, could lead to the breakdown of our governments. It could lead to the dismissal by President Trump of our House and our Senate, the standing down or the removal of any judges that disagree with him. Martial law allows you to play by no rules and to do whatever is necessary to bring about your desired end. And that kind of totalitarian takeover, I believe, would absolutely lead to the destruction of our nation. And I think his only hope is to deal with this decisively, more or less non-violently, and combat it with sheer numbers, right? A takeover of the blue cities until order is restored. But my problem with all of that is there's no way to do that without violating the constitutional rights of the everyday working man and woman who are just trying to feed their family and live their lives. And I don't know. Tell me what you think in the comment section. You think he's going to do it? I think if he doesn't do it, it's going to escalate. Like, he's going to have to take some decisive action. Should he? What would your response be to being pulled over on your way to work at 10 o'clock at night and told you're not allowed on the streets and have to show your identification and prove you're on your way to work? Right? We saw this during COVID, so don't think it's impossible, because they were doing this to us during the COVID lockdown. And they've got the practice. It was a practice run. And with the help, especially of certain local law enforcement, or the nationalization of local law enforcement duties by federal agents, we could see this kind of thing on our streets. Would you comply? Even though I'm not part of this, I'm just trying to go to work. But I also don't like my constitutional rights being trampled, and I don't care what your excuse is. So what's your response? Are you in favor of this? Are you against it? Do you think it's a good idea? You think he's really going to do it? Tell me in the comments section, and don't forget to support this channel. It's funded by viewers like you. Through the description in the links below, you can become through the links in the description below, you can become a financial contributor to help keep this channel on the air. We'll see you next time from my cabin down by the creek. Oh, I still have long hair, by the way.